She did not find out her husband was leaving by a conversation. She did not find out by a fight or a confession or even a text message. She found out by an eviction notice, slipped under the front door. While she was still wearing the dress she buried her mother in, her husband's signature at the bottom,
Consider it done.
another woman's name listed as the new
luck
occupant,
is finally
her
on our
address,
side,
the home
wouldn't you
she
agree?
had cooked in, planted a garden in, come home to, for 9 years, 30 days to get out. And here is the part nobody in that house, nobody at that funeral, nobody at that dinner table for 11 years ever knew Eleanor Hartwell was worth $40.2 billion. Not her husband, her. Built quietly, built carefully, built across 11 years of a marriage to a man who believed he was the one holding everything together, while his wife was, without a single word, holding something infinitely larger. She did not scream when she read that notice. She did not cry. She opened a drawer, took out one folder, and made one phone call. That phone call ended a marriage and began something that would leave 400 people in a Manhattan ballroom completely silent. Stay with this story, because what Eleanor did next, and how she did it, is going to change the way you think about silence, patience, and exactly what a woman is capable of when she has been underestimated long enough. What you're about to hear is not just a story about betrayal. It is a story about what happens when a woman who has been building in the dark finally steps into the light, and the light turns out to be hers. If this kind of story speaks to something in you, hit subscribe before we begin. Every story on this channel is made for the ones who stayed quiet and kept building. You are in the right place. Now, let us begin.
She was still wearing the dress she buried her mother in when the eviction notice slid under the front door. Eleanor Hartwell stood in the entryway of the house she had lived in for 9 years and looked down at the envelope on the hardwood floor and did not move for a long moment. The dress was black wool, slightly wrinkled from 2 days of wear, still carrying the faint smell of the cemetery. Cold earth and white lilies and the particular stillness of a place where time has stopped mattering. She had not changed. She had not been able to bring herself to. She picked up the envelope. She opened it. Her husband's signature was at the bottom. So was another woman's name, listed as the future occupant of the property. Her address. The address she had lived at, cooked at, planted a garden at, come home to for 9 years. 30 days to vacate the premises. Eleanor Hartwell did not scream. She did not cry. She did not sit down on the floor the way some part of her wanted to. She walked to the kitchen. She opened the second drawer on the left, the one that held batteries and rubber bands and the things that did not belong anywhere else. She took out a single manila folder. She took out her phone. She made one phone call. That phone call changed everything. But to understand why, you need to understand everything that came before it. If you have ever signed a document your spouse placed in front of you without reading it carefully, stay with this story. Eleanor did that once. Just once. And she spent the next 6 years making absolutely certain it would never happen again. This is the story of what happened before that moment in the entryway, and everything that came after. Virginia Cole died on a Tuesday morning in a hospice room in Hartford, Connecticut, at 7:14 in the morning, while her daughter held her hand and the window above the bed showed a sky, the pale gray of old linen. Eleanor had been there for 11 days. She had slept in the recliner beside the bed every night, a pillow wedged behind her lower back because she was 6 months pregnant, and the recliner was not designed for a woman in her condition. She had eaten crackers from the vending machine at the end of the hall and drunk decaf coffee from a paper cup and watched her mother get smaller and quieter in the way that people get smaller and quieter at the end, as though they are already in the process of becoming something the living cannot follow. She had called Richard on day 3 and told him she thought it was soon. He had said he would come. He arrived on day 5, stayed 4 hours, checked his phone throughout, and drove back to Westport that evening, saying he had an early meeting. He kissed Eleanor on the forehead before he left. The kiss landed somewhere slightly off-center, the way his attention had been landing slightly off-center for the better part of 2 years. Virginia died with Eleanor's hand in hers, and the room very quiet. And that was the end of a woman who had been the fixed point around which Eleanor had oriented her entire life since she was old enough to understand what a fixed point was. The funeral was held 4 days later at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Greenwich. White lilies, a string quartet Virginia had requested in a handwritten note tucked inside her Bible between the pages of Romans, a eulogy Eleanor had written herself at 2 a.m. in the hotel room near the hospice. Because she had not been able to sleep, and writing it had felt like the last useful thing she could do for her mother. Richard told Eleanor on the morning of the funeral that he had a work situation that required his attention, but that he would be there. He arrived during the second hymn. He sat in the back pew. He left before the burial. Eleanor watched his car pull out of the church parking lot from the window of the vestibule and felt something she could not name exactly, not surprise, not even hurt in the sharp sense, but something slower and more final, like the last degree of warmth leaving a room. The reception was held at Virginia's house on Birchwood Lane. A white colonial that smelled like lavender and wood smoke and the particular accumulated warmth of a woman who had made a home out of intention rather than money. Neighbors came, friends from Virginia's church came, women who had known Virginia for 30 years came and brought food and told Eleanor that her mother had been extraordinary, which Eleanor already knew. Dorothy Hartwell arrived with Richard's sister Judith and moved through the rooms of Virginia's house with the careful eyes of a woman conducting an assessment. She touched the mantelpiece. She examined the watercolors on the wall. She told Eleanor's aunt that the house was charming in a dated sort of way. She did not ask Eleanor how she was feeling. She did not once mention the baby. Maggie Cole had been Eleanor's closest friend since graduate school. A small, sharp-eyed woman who could find the precise absurdity in any situation and deploy it like a scalpel. She stood beside Eleanor, near the food table, for most of the reception, and kept her company in the way that required no performance. When Dorothy drifted past them, toward the kitchen with the expression of someone cataloging inventory, Maggie leaned close to Eleanor and said very quietly, "She just measured the length of your mother's dining table with her eyes. I watched her do it. She used her hand as a unit of measurement." Eleanor looked at her. Maggie said, "I'm not even a little bit joking." Eleanor almost laughed. Almost. It was close enough to count. The moment that mattered came near the end of the afternoon. Eleanor went upstairs to find her mother's reading glasses, which she had promised to give to her mother's oldest friend before she left. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dim and quiet, the sounds of the reception muffled below. Judith was standing near the window at the end of the hall with her phone out, showing something to a woman Eleanor did not recognize. She was laughing. The specific, private laugh of someone sharing something they know they should not be sharing. When she saw Eleanor at the top of the stairs, she put the phone away in one movement too quickly and smiled, and the smile was the wrong shape entirely. Eleanor said nothing. She found the glasses. She went back downstairs. She found Virginia's oldest friend and placed the glasses in her hands and said the right things in the right order. Then she excused herself and went to the bathroom off the kitchen and locked the door and sat on the edge of the bathtub and put both hands flat on her pregnant belly and breathed, in and out, counting the breaths the way her mother had taught her when she was a little girl who was afraid of thunderstorms, In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. She allowed herself 3 minutes. She counted those 2. Then she unlocked the door and went back to her guests and thanked every single one of them for coming and accepted their casseroles and their sympathy and their careful, well-meaning embraces. And not a single person in that house knew what had just happened to her face in that bathroom, not even Maggie. That was exactly how Eleanor needed it to be. There is a kind of woman who has learned to compress her grief into small, manageable windows because she knows that if she opens the whole door at once, she will not be able to close it again. Virginia Cole had been that kind of woman. She had taught her daughter, by example, the way women teach the things that matter most. Not in formal lessons, but in daily demonstrations. In the quiet discipline of a woman moving through difficulty, upright and without broadcasting her pain, to people who had not earned the right to witness it. Eleanor was her mother's daughter in every way that counted. She drove to the hotel that evening after the house had been cleaned and the guests had gone and the last casserole had been covered and refrigerated. She sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes before going inside. She sat the same way she had sat on the edge of that bathtub, hands on her belly, breathing. The baby moved, a slow rolling shift, like something adjusting its position toward the warmth. "I know," Eleanor said to the empty car. "I know." 3 days after the funeral, Eleanor drove back to Westport. She had the windows down, despite the November cold, because she needed the air. The specific relief of moving through open space after 2 weeks of rooms full of people and their needs and their feelings and their well-intentioned presence. She needed the sound of the highway and the feeling of going somewhere under her own direction, even if the somewhere she was going was a house that had been feeling less like hers for longer than she had been willing to name. She pulled into the driveway on Maple Crest Drive and noticed immediately that Richard's car was gone. His side of the 2-car garage was empty, not just absent for the day, but empty in the way of a space that has been deliberately cleared. The garden tools that hung on the side porch were gone. The recycling bin he had always managed was gone. Inside confirmed what the outside had suggested. His closet, empty, his dresser, bare. The framed photograph from their 10th anniversary trip to Nantucket, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said, the harbor bright behind them, gone from its place in the upstairs hallway. The good bourbon he kept on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet, gone. She stood in the middle of the living room and understood what she was looking at without needing to be told. Then she took out her phone and called his number. He answered on the second ring. His voice was flat and settled, the voice of a man who had made a decision long enough ago that the decision had become comfortable. He told her he had filed for divorce 3 weeks prior. He told her the house was in his name. A refinance they had completed in 2019, a stack of papers she had signed without reading carefully because she trusted him and because he had told her it was routine. He told her she had 30 days to make other arrangements. And then he said it, the part that landed like a physical thing, like the floor shifting under her feet. He said that he and Cassandra would be needing the space. He hung up before she could respond. The line went to silence and then to the empty sound of a disconnected call, and Eleanor stood in her living room, holding her phone and looked out the front window at the maple tree in the yard that she had watched turn red every October for 9 years. Write this down and write it somewhere you will see it. A refinance document is not a small piece of paperwork. It is a complete restructuring of legal ownership. It can change who has the right to stay and who has the obligation to go. If a spouse ever presents you with one and asks you to sign it quickly, without time to have your own attorney review it independently, that is not love and it is not routine. Eleanor learned this at the worst possible moment so that you do not have to learn it at yours. Dorothy called 20 minutes later. She did not begin with condolences for Virginia. She began with the house. She said the property had always been intended to remain in the family. Richard's family, she specified, with a precision that left nothing ambiguous. She said she hoped Eleanor understood. And then, with the particular warmth of a woman tasting a victory she has been patient about for a long time, she said that 30 days was actually quite generous. She said she was sure Eleanor would land on her feet. She hung up before Eleanor could respond. That was probably intentional. Eleanor stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of her own breathing for a long moment. Then she looked around the room, the copper pendant light she had chosen, the subway tile she had spent 3 weekends picking out, the herbs on the windowsill, rosemary, thyme, the basil that always struggled through winter, that she had planted and tended and replanted every spring. Her phone buzzed. A notification. Cassandra had posted. The photo showed the kitchen, Eleanor's kitchen with Eleanor's light and Eleanor's tile and Eleanor's herbs still on the windowsill. Cassandra was standing at the counter holding the ceramic mug Eleanor had bought at a small pottery studio on Church Street in Burlington, Vermont, on the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, when the air had smelled like maple and cold and something that had felt, at the time, like it might last. The caption read, "New chapter, new kitchen, new everything." Richard had liked the post. Within 6 minutes. Maggie called 4 minutes after that. Eleanor could hear her breathing before she even said a word. The specific, controlled breathing of a woman who has seen something that has made her genuinely furious and is working to deliver that fury at a useful, rather than destructive frequency. She said, "She is using your Le Creuset Dutch oven, Eleanor. I can see it on the counter behind her. I need you to understand that I do not particularly care about the husband anymore, but I care deeply and personally about that Dutch oven, because you paid $285 for it, and I was there when you bought it, and that woman has no right to it." Eleanor was sitting in the parking lot of the Marriott on Post Road. She had driven there without entirely deciding to. She looked out at the entrance of the hotel and made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that had not decided yet what it was. Maggie said, "I'm coming over." Eleanor said, "I'm not at the house." A pause, then, "Oh." And then, more quietly, "Oh, Ellie." Eleanor checked in to room 412, a king bed, a view of the parking structure, a minibar she did not touch. She sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on and her mother's leather journal in her lap and looked at the wall for a while. Then she opened the journal. Virginia had kept it for 30 years. The pages were soft from handling, filled with financial notes and scripture references and small observations about the world written in her careful, looping hand because she had believed that writing a thing made it more real and therefore more possible to act on. Eleanor turned the pages slowly. She found an entry from 1987, written when Virginia was 31 years old, younger than Eleanor was now. At the bottom of the page, underlined twice, "The woman who survives is not the loudest one in the room. She is the one who keeps her receipts." Eleanor read it 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and called Thomas Wren. Thomas Wren operated out of a building in downtown Hartford with no sign on the door and a receptionist who confirmed nothing. He was 51 years old, methodical in the way that good attorneys are methodical. Not showy, not dramatic, simply thorough in a way that accumulated into something formidable over time. He had worked for Eleanor for 9 years. In 9 years, he had never met Richard. Richard had never heard his name. This had not been an accident. He answered on the first ring. He said, "Eleanor, we have been ready for this for 6 months." And here's what that meant. Eleanor had felt the marriage changing the way you feel a season changing, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small things. The longer silences at dinner, the shorter answers to direct questions, the way Richard had stopped asking anything real about her work, her days, her thoughts, the inner life he had once been genuinely curious about, the way he looked through her sometimes at the breakfast table, not at her, as though she had become part of the furniture, present but not requiring attention. She had not known the specific shape the ending would take. She had not known when, but she had felt it building with the certainty of something structural, and she had called Thomas 6 months ago and told him to begin preparing documentation, quietly, without drama, without letting Richard know that she had already seen him clearly enough to start getting ready. Thomas walked her through the situation on the phone in the particular calm of a man who has done his work and trusts what it has produced. The house on Maple Crest Drive had been purchased through a holding company. That holding company's assets traced directly and completely to Eleanor. Richard's name on the deed was one line in a 40-page document, and that document had been prepared by attorneys who had been building toward exactly this moment for the better part of a year. He said, "He has nothing that holds up Eleanor. The paper trail is complete. You are protected." Eleanor exhaled. It was the first time in 4 days that she had done so without holding something back. She ordered room service, tomato soup, and a club sandwich, because Virginia had always said that tomato soup fixed more things than medicine, and Eleanor had reached the point in grief where the old habits feel like the truest comfort available. She put her hand on her belly. She said, quietly, to the baby who had been keeping her company through all of it, "We are okay. We are going to be okay." She slept well that night, deeply and without interruption, for the first time in weeks. She did not know yet how temporary that feeling would be. The morning after the phone call with Thomas, Eleanor did 2 practical things before she got out of bed. She called her obstetrician's office to reschedule a prenatal appointment she had missed during the hospice stay. The nurse who answered told her the earliest available slot was Thursday and reminded her that her blood pressure had been running a little high at the last visit and that they would want to check it again. Eleanor said Thursday was fine. She wrote it in her phone calendar. Then she called Maggie. Maggie had already found her 2 furnished apartment listings and a third option she described as technically a sublet, but with excellent light and a landlord who did not ask unnecessary questions. Eleanor told her she was staying in the hotel for now, that Thomas was handling the legal situation, that she was all right. Maggie said, "Are you actually all right, or are you Eleanor all right?" Which is a completely different thing. Eleanor said, "I'm Eleanor all right." Maggie said, "Okay, I'm coming Saturday. I'm bringing food. Don't argue with me." Eleanor did not argue with her. She spent the rest of that week in room 412. She worked. She had always worked. It had always been the thing that organized her when everything else became disorganized. Video calls with the Geneva office, reviews of quarterly reports, a board decision that required her attention and got it, fully and precisely, because Eleanor Hartwell had never in her professional life allowed her personal situation to compromise the quality of her thinking. Her colleagues in Geneva would have had no idea, watching her on those calls, that she was sitting in a hotel room in Connecticut, 6 months pregnant, with an eviction notice in her coat pocket, and her mother 11 days in the ground. This was not performance. It was structure. It was the thing Virginia had built into her. The understanding that the work is real and the work continues and the work is, in its own way, a form of dignity that no one can evict you from. On Friday evening, she opened Virginia's journal again and found the entry she had been thinking about all week. The woman who survives is not the loudest one in the room. She is the one who keeps her receipts. Below it, in slightly older ink, an addition Virginia had made years later in the handwriting of a woman who had lived long enough to want to be more specific. A second line, Eleanor had not remembered until now. She does not announce what she is building. She simply builds it. And one day the building is done, and it is larger than anyone knew to expect. Eleanor sat with that for a long time. Then she closed the journal, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark and listened to the city outside the window and felt something settling in her. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the precursor to it. The stillness that comes before a decision fully becomes itself. She was past crying. She was becoming something else. She could feel it the way you feel a tide turning before the water visibly moves. On a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the eviction notice, Thomas called. His voice was carefully controlled in the way of a man who has trained himself to deliver difficult information without the delivery making things worse. He said, "There has been a development. I need you to listen to all of it before you respond." Someone had leaked the partial structure of Eleanor's holding company to Richard's attorney. Not the full picture, just enough. Just enough for Richard's legal team to file an emergency injunction claiming Eleanor had concealed marital assets and requesting a fraud investigation. The language in the filing was aggressive. The accounts were frozen pending review. Temporarily, but frozen, Thomas said. It is a delay tactic. They are working in the dark with partial information, and they know it. But it is going to take 8 to 12 weeks to clear the injunction completely. He said it carefully, knowing what 8 to 12 weeks meant against a 30-day eviction clock. Against a pregnancy now entering its third trimester. Eleanor sat on the edge of the hotel bed. She pressed her free hand flat against her thigh and felt the roughness of the bedspread under her palm. She said, "All right, what do we do first?" Not a question, a direction. They were still on the phone when the second call came in from her obstetrician's office. Eleanor told Thomas she would call him back. She answered the second call. Her blood pressure reading from that morning's routine check had come back at a level they were not comfortable with. They needed her to come in immediately. Not tomorrow, not this afternoon, now. She was admitted for observation within the hour. Stress-induced hypertension, the attending physician told her, common in third trimester pregnancies, manageable with monitoring and rest, but not something to treat casually. The baby's heartbeat was strong and steady. Eleanor was told to stay calm, which is the thing medical professionals tell patients when they understand that telling them to stop having the experience that caused the problem is not practical advice, but feel they must say something. She spent 2 nights in the hospital. Maggie booked the first available flight back from Chicago, which was not until the following morning. Richard did not come. He did not call. He sent a text message that read, "Heard you were in the hospital. Hope everything is okay." He used a period at the end. Eleanor read it once, set the phone face down on the bedside table, and did not look at it again for 4 hours. Cassandra posted a Wellness Wednesday that evening. The photo showed her drinking green tea by a window, Eleanor's kitchen window, the one that caught the morning light. The caption was about protecting your peace from toxic energy. She used 3 different leaf emojis. Carol Henderson was the night shift nurse. Mid-50s, the kind of woman who has worked a labor and delivery ward for 27 years and has developed a finely calibrated understanding of which patients need clinical efficiency and which ones need a human being to sit with them for a few minutes. She read Eleanor's intake paperwork. She looked at the section asking about primary sources of stress. She looked at Eleanor. She pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat down. She said, "In 27 years, I have had two kinds of patients in this unit. The ones who are here because of something their body did, and the ones who are here because of a man and a woman who is not his wife." She patted Eleanor's hand once, firmly. "You are the second kind, honey. The blood pressure I can fix. The rest of it, you are handling better than you think you are." Eleanor looked at her. She said, "How can you tell?" Carol said, "Because you're not crying. The ones who are handling it are always the ones who stopped crying a little while ago. The crying part is over, and now they're just moving." She stood up and checked the monitor and wrote something in the chart. "You get some sleep. That baby needs you rested more than she needs you brave right now." Eleanor slept. Not well, but enough. On the second morning, Dorothy made phone calls. Eleanor did not know this until Patricia Norwood, a colleague she had worked alongside for 11 years, is a woman who ran a foundation in Boston and had collaborated with Eleanor on 3 major educational initiatives, called her hospital room directly at 9 in the morning. Patricia read her the voicemail Dorothy had left, word for word, in a voice that communicated exactly how seriously she was taking it and exactly what she thought of it. Dorothy had told 4 of Eleanor's professional contacts that Eleanor had been emotionally unstable for years, that the pregnancy had been a last attempt to save a failing marriage, that the situation had become concerning, that she worried for the people Eleanor worked with. 2 of the 4 colleagues had already sent carefully worded emails suggesting they postpone pending collaborations. Eleanor lay in the hospital bed and listened to Patricia read every word. The blood pressure monitor beeped its steady rhythm beside her. The accounts were frozen. The eviction clock was running. Her professional reputation was being quietly, methodically taken apart by a woman in Greenwich with a church hat and a telephone, and Eleanor was lying in a hospital bed attached to a monitor, and there was nothing she could do about any of it from here. The baby kicked, hard. The particular kick of a small person with emphatic opinions who has decided to make one known. Eleanor put her hand on her belly. She stared at the ceiling tiles and felt the full weight of everything that was happening to her at once. The accumulated pressure of it, the sheer quantity of it, the way loss had been arriving in consecutive waves without enough space between them to recover. She said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "I know, I know." When powerful people feel genuinely threatened, they do not come for your money first. They come for your credibility, your reputation, your sanity. Because if they can make the people around you question your judgment, no one will trust your evidence when the evidence finally comes out. Eleanor had known this was possible. Thomas had warned her. She had prepared for it specifically. That preparation was the only reason what came next did not destroy her. Carol Henderson walked Eleanor to the hospital exit on a Friday morning. Blood pressure stabilized, baby's heartbeat measured and strong, a printed discharge summary in Eleanor's hand with instructions she already knew she would follow precisely because she was that kind of person. Carol said at the door, "You come back when that little one decides she is ready. Not before." She squeezed Eleanor's arm once. "You're going to be fine. I've been doing this long enough to know." Maggie had found her an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Elm Street in New Haven while Eleanor was in the hospital. 3rd floor, east-facing windows, hardwood floors, and, most importantly, Maggie reported, a doorman named Gerald Brooks, who had worked the front desk for 19 years and operated on the foundational philosophy that his residents' personal business was entirely their own. Gerald was 53, solidly built, with reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck, and a desk he presided over with the calm of a man who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. He looked up when Eleanor came through the lobby the first morning, visibly exhausted, 6 months pregnant, moving like a woman who has been through several consecutive events she did not choose. And he assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds. He reached under the desk. He set a can of ginger ale on the counter. He said, "Complimentary." He went back to his newspaper. Eleanor looked at the ginger ale. She looked at Gerald. She said, "Thank you." Gerald said, "112 if you need anything." That was the beginning of a professional friendship that Eleanor would come to value more than she could have anticipated on that first morning. The injunction was lifted on a Tuesday. Thomas filed the counter documentation the same afternoon. 11 years of financial records, the full holding company structure, the chain of ownership on the Maple Crest Drive property, tracing directly and completely to Eleanor. Richard's attorney reviewed the documentation over 3 days. On Thursday, he called Thomas to say he was withdrawing from the case. He had a practice to protect. The paper trail was complete. He was sorry for the trouble. Thomas called Eleanor immediately after and told her. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the new apartment with a cup of tea and the morning light coming in from the east, and she listened to everything Thomas said. And when he finished, she said, "What happens to the house?" Thomas said, "It reverts to your holding company, full and uncontested." Eleanor said, "Good." She set down her tea. "What else do we need to do?" That was who Eleanor was. The victory was noted, and then the next task was identified, and the work continued. Richard called on a Thursday evening. It was the first time he had actually called, not texted, called, in 6 weeks. Eleanor almost did not answer. She answered. His voice was different. The settled flatness was gone, and in its place was something uncertain, something that had been living with itself long enough to become uncomfortable. He said things carefully, that perhaps the timing had been wrong, that perhaps they should talk, that perhaps things had moved too quickly. Underneath every word, not quite said but present in the gaps between sentences, was the possibility that he had made a mistake and was looking for a way to say so that would cost him the least. Eleanor listened to all of it. She let him finish completely. Then she said, "Thomas will be in touch, Richard." She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. She thought about everything that voice had meant to her at various points in her life. The early years when it had made her laugh, the middle years when it had started to feel like background noise, the recent years when the sound of it had begun to carry a low frequency of unease she had not been able to name until she was far enough away to see it clearly. She thought about Virginia, about the journal entry, about receipts. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went to the kitchen to start dinner because she was hungry and the baby needed feeding, and some things are simply that practical. Maggie came over that evening with Thai takeout in 4 containers and the specific energy of a woman who has been worried and is relieved and is managing both feelings simultaneously. They sat on the floor of the mostly empty apartment. Ellie's back against the couch, Maggie's legs stretched toward the coffee table, and ate Padsy U out of containers and watched something forgettable on television. Maggie said, at some point between the 2nd episode and the 3rd, "It's over, right? You won." Eleanor said, "Almost." She meant it as reassurance. She did not yet know how precisely accurate she was. Thomas called on a Monday. He had been tracing the source of the leak. The partial holding company structure that had made its way to Richard's attorney and triggered the injunction that had frozen the accounts and landed Eleanor in the hospital. It had taken his team 3 weeks of documentation review to find the thread. They had followed it carefully because Thomas was thorough and because the answer, when it came, needed to be certain. He said, "Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it." The leak had not come from Dorothy. It had not come from Judith. It had come from Maggie, not from malice, not from anything that resembled intention or planning or any desire to hurt Eleanor. 18 months ago, during Maggie's own divorce, a brutal, exhausting 8-month process that had hollowed her out, Richard had approached her at a dinner party, standing near the kitchen, wine in hand, warm and casual, and apparently concerned. He had asked how Eleanor was really doing, how she was really holding up. With the practiced sincerity of a man who has learned to weaponize warmth. And Maggie, exhausted and lonely, and not thinking about what she was being asked or why, had mentioned the Geneva office in passing, just mentioned it. The way you mention something when it does not feel like a secret because you have never once considered the person asking might be building something with the answer. She had forgotten about it within the week. She had not connected it to anything that had happened to Eleanor, not until now. Thomas said, "I am sorry to be the one to tell you this." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you for finding it." She set the phone down. She sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the elm trees were bare against a pale sky. She thought about 11 years of a friendship that had been the truest constant in her adult life outside of Virginia. She thought about Maggie showing up at the hospital, Maggie finding the apartment, Maggie sitting on the floor, bed, eating takeout, and asking if it was over. She had not known. Eleanor was certain she had not known, but she had not told her either. There was a knock at the apartment door 40 minutes later. Eleanor opened it. Maggie was standing in the hallway and had been crying and was still crying and clearly had been for some time. Someone at Richard's former attorney's office had talked, and the information had found Maggie the way information eventually finds the people it concerns. She said, I know what you know. I came to tell you myself, and I'm too late, and I'm sorry." Eleanor stepped back from the doorway. Maggie came inside. Eleanor sat in the chair by the window. Maggie sat on the floor, with her back against the wall, the way she had always sat on floors since they were in graduate school together, and they stayed like that with the sound of the street coming up through the glass, and neither of them speaking for a long time. The people who hurt us most are rarely strangers with deliberate intentions. They are most often the ones closest to us who made one mistake they could not figure out how to correct in time. And so the silence grew, and the silence became a wall, and the wall stood between two people who genuinely loved each other. This is not a story about betrayal. It is a story about what happens when we carry things alone that we should have put down sooner. Eleanor said, "Did you know what you were giving him?" Maggie said, "No, I swear to you, I didn't understand what he was asking or why, but I should have told you the moment I remembered. I should have come to you immediately, and I didn't because I was afraid of what it would cost me. And that was wrong. That was completely wrong, and I cannot fix that I didn't do it, and I am sorry." A silence. Eleanor said, "I know." She did not say, "I forgive you." That would not have been honest, and she refused to perform it. But she did not say, "Leave." That was also honest. The friendship was 20 years old, and it had more weight and more truth in it than any single mistake. And Eleanor knew this, even in the middle of the thing that had hurt her. After another long silence, Maggie said, very quietly, almost to the floor, "For what it's worth, I only mentioned the Connecticut account. I did not know there were others." Eleanor looked at her. "There's also one in Luxembourg." Maggie put both hands over her face. and one in the Cayman Islands. Maggie slid slowly down the wall until she was essentially lying on the floor looking at the ceiling. She said, "I cannot believe I only caused partial damage entirely by accident." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Then she almost smiled. It was small, and it cost her something to produce it, but it was real. "You caused enough," she said. But the way she said it was not the way you say something is over. It was the way you say something that is true and hard, and that you are willing to sit with until it becomes something you can both carry. Maggie, still on the floor, said, "Does this mean I'm still head of recovery operations?" Eleanor looked at the ceiling. "Get off my floor," she said. Maggie got up. She made tea. They sat at the kitchen table as the afternoon light shifted and talked about the things that needed talking about, slowly and without the performance of resolution. Because real resolution takes longer than one afternoon, and both of them knew it. The Hartwell Community Foundation Charity Gala was held every November at the Meridian Grand Ballroom in Midtown Manhattan. Black tie, 8 courses, a live auction, a string quartet in the corner, and a room full of the particular kind of people who attend, because being seen in that room by the right people is itself a form of currency. Richard had attended for years. He was not a major donor. He gave modestly and strategically, enough to secure a good table, enough to be in the room and have the room know he was in it. This year he arrived with Cassandra Monroe on his arm, red dress, chosen specifically to be noticed. The kind of entrance that announces itself. Dorothy was in cream at the same table. Judith sat nearby, pleased with the evening in the way of someone who has decided the right side won. Richard had been refining his story for 2 months, and it had settled into a shape he was comfortable wearing. The patient husband, the wife broken by grief, emotionally unavailable, impossible to reach in any meaningful way. He had tried. He had held on longer than most men would have. He deserved peace and had finally chosen it. People told him so. They told him he had done the right thing, and he accepted this with the practiced humility of a man who believed it completely. The ballroom moved through its first hour without incident. The salads arrived. The auction opened. The orchestra played something pleasant and undemanding. Richard was relaxed in the particular way of a man who believes the difficult portion of a situation is behind him. The room shifted at 8:17. It was subtle at first, the way a current changes in a large body of water before the surface shows it. Heads turned near the main entrance. A ripple moved inward from the doors, the specific ripple that moves through a room when someone enters who changes its atmosphere simply by being present. Eleanor Hartwell walked into the Meridian Grand Ballroom in midnight blue, not theatrical, not designed to make a statement in the way that statements are usually made, loudly, with announcement, simply and completely right, in the way that things are right when they have been arrived at through a long and serious process rather than assembled for an occasion. 6 months and 3 weeks pregnant, carrying it the way Virginia had always carried difficulty, deliberately, as if it were a choice rather than a condition. Thomas Wren, on her left, composed and unhurried. Clara Whitfield, on her right. Sharp, silent, with the stillness of an attorney who has prepared thoroughly and has nothing left to prove in the preparation. Maggie just behind, chin up, in the manner of a woman who has been waiting for this specific evening for some time and intends to be fully present for every moment of it. Richard's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Cassandra followed his gaze across the ballroom and found something she had not prepared herself for. The version of Eleanor she had constructed in her mind, grieving, destabilized, evicted, and diminished, was one thing. The woman standing at the entrance of the Meridian in midnight blue, flanked by 2 attorneys, with the stillness of someone who has already finished winning and is now simply present to watch it become official, was something else entirely. Cassandra turned to Richard. Richard had nothing to say. The event host moved to the podium. He thanked the room. He paused. The particular pause of a man about to say something he finds genuinely remarkable and wants the room to hear properly. He said that this year, the gala's lead benefactor, a donor who had funded the event anonymously for 11 consecutive years, whose contributions had made possible the overwhelming majority of the Foundation's educational programming, whose generosity had operated in complete silence for over a decade, had decided for the first time to be publicly known. He said her name, Eleanor Ann Hartwell. Her company name appeared on the screen behind him in clean white letters. Below it, a second line that resolved slowly, deliberately, as 400 people watched in complete silence. $40.2 billion in assets under management. Active investment portfolios across 6 countries. Educational and community development initiatives that had reshaped 4 American cities over the course of 11 years. 11 years. The same 11 years she had been married to Richard Hartwell. The same 11 years Dorothy had been telling her she had no claim on anything that mattered. The room went still in the way rooms go still when they have to recalibrate everything they believed they understood. At table 12, no one spoke. Richard set his glass down. The easy confidence, the comfort of a man living inside a story he had written himself and told so many times it felt true, went out of his face. The whole architecture of it became visible for what it was. A structure built on a misunderstanding, so complete that the gap between what he had believed and what was true now looked like a canyon, and he was standing at the edge of it in front of 400 people in black tie. Dorothy sat very straight in her cream dress with her hands flat on the table. She said nothing. This was, Eleanor would reflect later, probably the most honest thing Dorothy had done in 11 years. Cassandra looked at the screen. She looked at Richard's face. She looked back at the screen. She reached for her water glass and took a long, slow drink and set it down carefully and did not speak. Eleanor was brought to the podium. She stood before that room with the ease of a woman who had addressed rooms like this one 100 times, which she had. She spoke about Virginia, about a woman in a white colonial in Greenwich who kept a worn leather journal and wrote the same 3 words twice in 1987 because she believed that writing a thing made it more real. Keep your receipts. She talked about what it had meant to build something quietly without needing anyone to witness the building to know it was real. She was warm and specific and composed with the composure of someone for whom composure is no longer an effort, but simply what they are made of. She did not look at table 12 once. When the applause was still moving through the room, Thomas Wren made his way through the space between tables with the quiet efficiency of a man who has done this kind of work before. He reached table 12. He placed a sealed legal envelope in front of Richard. Counterfiling. 11 years of documentation. The house on Maplecrest Drive. The refinance. The holding company. The full paper trail assembled by attorneys who had been building toward exactly this moment for 6 months before Richard ever filed for divorce. She had known the ending was coming. She had felt it building in the long silences and the short answers and the way he had stopped asking real questions about her life. She had let him believe he was driving the story all the way until the moment she took the wheel. Richard opened the envelope. He read the first page slowly. He looked up across the ballroom at Eleanor, who was speaking with the event host near the podium. Her back to him, one hand resting gently on her belly, her posture easy and unhurried. He stood. He walked toward her. The room noticed. He said her name. She turned. She looked at him with the complete stillness of a woman who has already finished this conversation many times in her own mind and is now simply watching it happen in the physical world. She said, "Thomas will be in touch, Richard." She turned back to her conversation. He stood in the middle of the Meridian Grand Ballroom, holding an envelope full of consequences, in a room that now knew everything. And then he walked back to table 12 and sat down and did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. Clara Whitfield moved to the table quietly while Richard was still reading. She approached Dorothy specifically. She set down a single document, separate from the divorce counterfiling, unrelated to the house. It was a copy of a letter, Dorothy's letter, written on Dorothy's personal stationery in Dorothy's handwriting, sent to 3 of Eleanor's professional colleagues 15 months ago, before the divorce was filed, coordinating with Richard's plan and establishing that the campaign against Eleanor's professional reputation had been organized and deliberate. The letter was Exhibit C in a defamation filing. Dorothy picked up the document. She read it. She set it down in front of her. She looked at the middle distance, at the space between where she was and where she had believed this evening would end. And she sat very straight and said nothing, and the silence around her was the loudest thing at the table. The consequences did not arrive with fanfare. That was perhaps the most complete thing about them. Richard's attorney called on a Friday afternoon. The man whose office sat above a tax preparation storefront, whose confidence had always exceeded his competence by a margin that had until now not cost him visibly. He said he was withdrawing from the case. The documentation was thorough and complete. There was no viable path forward. He wished Richard well. Richard spent 11 days looking for another attorney willing to review the materials. Several had already heard about the gala. One agreed to a consultation and then called back after reviewing the documents to say there was no case worth building. The house on Maple Crest Drive reverted to Eleanor's holding company. Full, uncontested, final. Richard's personal savings, reduced by legal fees from 2 attorneys, and the security deposit Cassandra had required before she left him with less than he had started with. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city. He did not post about it. Cassandra had been in that ballroom. She had seen the number on the screen. She had watched Richard's face do what it did when the story he had been living inside became suddenly and completely visible for what it was. She spent 3 days doing research after the gala. The kind of thorough, compulsive research you do when you are trying to understand the full dimensions of a mistake you have already made and cannot unmake. On the 4th day, she posted an apology. It was vague and carefully worded, expressing regret in general terms without naming anyone or anything specifically, using the word journey 4 times and the phrase, "my truth," twice. It was mocked on every platform where it appeared with the thoroughness that the internet reserves for performances it recognizes as performances. She deleted it within 12 hours. She deleted the kitchen photos. She deleted the captions about new chapters and new kitchens and new everything. She stopped answering Richard's calls after the 6th one. She blocked his number after the 22nd. She sent a goodbye text that took 4 drafts to write and 6 seconds to send. Dorothy's defamation exposure was assessed by her attorney in a meeting that lasted 1 hour and that Dorothy did not enjoy. The recommendation was to settle quickly and without public statement. She did. She did not call Eleanor. She did not arrive at her door. Several weeks after the gala, a card arrived in Eleanor's mailbox. Plain white, Dorothy's initials embossed at the top, the handwriting angular and deliberate as always. It read, I made up my mind about you in the first year and never once reconsidered it. I decided what you were, and I never checked whether I was right. That failure cost you a great deal. I am sorry for it. Eleanor read it once. She placed it inside Virginia's journal, between 2 pages, carefully. Not because she forgave Dorothy completely. That would take longer than a card, longer than an apology, and might not arrive in full, even then. But because Virginia had always said that an honest accounting deserves to be preserved, even when it is late in coming, even when it costs less to produce than it cost the person who received the original damage. Judith lost a significant partnership deal, 18 months of work she had been building, a connection she had counted on. She did not know until it dissolved that the key figure in that deal had known Eleanor professionally for 11 years and had been watching. Judith called Richard when she found out. He had nothing useful to offer. They stayed on the phone in silence for a while, which was more honest than most of what either of them had done recently. Patricia Norwood, the colleague who had called Eleanor in the hospital room and read her Dorothy's voicemail word for word, sent a different kind of message after the gala. She said, I always knew something about this situation was wrong. I am glad the receipts were in order. Eleanor wrote back. They always were. They had a meeting in Boston 3 weeks later about a new initiative, and it was the best working conversation Eleanor had in the entire year. Maggie arrived every Saturday morning for the rest of that winter. She brought food and terrible reality television recommendations and updates she called situation reports, delivered with the editorial precision of a woman who took her self-appointed role seriously. One Saturday in December, she arrived with a small succulent in a terracotta pot, which she set on Eleanor's kitchen windowsill and named Gerald Jr. in honor of the doorman downstairs without explaining her reasoning. Eleanor looked at the plant. She looked at Maggie. A real laugh came up out of her, the kind that comes from somewhere unheld, somewhere deep and unguarded, the kind she had not allowed herself in a long time. It felt like something coming back that she had not realized was gone. Why Gerald, she said. Maggie said, same energy, steady, reliable, absolutely no unnecessary drama. Eleanor looked at the plant. She could not argue with this. The people who build false foundations are more fragile than the people they build them on. Because a lie requires constant maintenance. It requires the ongoing agreement of everyone around you to keep accepting the version of reality you have constructed. The truth requires nothing but patience. Eleanor's truth had been patient for 11 years. When it finally moved, there was nothing left to negotiate. The new house was on a quiet street in Greenwich, 3 blocks from where Virginia's house on Birchwood Lane had stood before it was sold to settle the estate. The trees on either side of the road were old enough to meet overhead in the middle, making a canopy that turned gold in late October and bare and architectural in winter, and was coming back now in the particular tentative green of early spring. Eleanor had moved in February. She had chosen every room herself, arranged every piece of furniture herself, filled the shelves with the books she had been meaning to have accessible for years, and the objects that were entirely and unambiguously hers. Not compromised, not negotiated, not arranged around someone else's preferences. The kitchen faced east. In the morning, the light came through the window and filled the whole room gold for approximately 40 minutes. Eleanor had learned this in the first week and began waking early to sit in it with her coffee and the particular quiet of a house that is entirely your own. This was not a small thing. It was, in fact, quite a large thing, and she took it seriously. Virginia Margaret Hartwell was born on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Virginia Cole had died, a coincidence Eleanor found neither devastating nor strange. She found it complete, as though the shape of things had its own logic that moved at its own pace and did not require her understanding to be true. The labor was 17 hours. Carol Henderson was not on shift when it began, but came in anyway when the floor called her, because she had made a point of leaving her number with Eleanor's chart and saying to call regardless of the hour. She sat with Eleanor through the difficult middle portion of the night with the practical, unperforming warmth of a woman who has been present for this enough times to know what it actually requires versus what people imagine it requires. At 4:47 in the morning, in a room that was quiet and warm and lit with the particular softness of a place where something important is happening, Virginia Margaret Hartwell arrived in the world and announced herself immediately and with great conviction, which Carol said was an excellent sign and which Eleanor received as entirely consistent with the personality she had been anticipating for months. The baby had Virginia's hands. Eleanor noticed it immediately, the particular width of the palm, the way the fingers curved. She held her daughter in the dawn light of that room and felt something she did not have a word for that was larger than grief and larger than relief, and was perhaps simply the experience of being, after a long and difficult passage, on the other side of it. She did not tell anyone about the hands for 4 days. She kept it privately, the way Virginia had taught her to keep things that belonged to her first, not from secrecy, but from the simple knowledge that some things need to be yours alone for a little while before they can be shared. She named her daughter Virginia Margaret, Virginia for her mother, Margaret for Maggie, who was not told in advance. The moment Eleanor said it, in the hospital room on the second afternoon, Maggie sitting in the chair beside the bed, holding the baby with the careful focus of a woman who is treating this as both an honor and a serious responsibility, Maggie went completely silent. 43 seconds. Eleanor timed it because she had suspected this might be the outcome, and she wanted the full measure of it. When Maggie recovered, she said, "You named her after me." Eleanor said, "Her middle name." Maggie said, "I am not going to make this weird." She immediately made it comprehensively weird. She arrived the next morning with a onesie that read, "Auntie Maggie's favorite," in pink letters, a mobile for the nursery that played Fleetwood Mac, and a small succulent she placed on the windowsill of the hospital room and named Gerald III without any explanation. Eleanor looked at the plant. She looked at Maggie. She did not ask about Gerald II. Some continuities are better honored than interrogated. Gerald Brooks sent flowers to the hospital. The card, written in his careful block handwriting, read, "Congratulations, Miss Hartwell. The ginger ale remains complimentary." Eleanor had it framed. It hung in the nursery beside the window. Thomas Wren sent a brief, formal note of congratulation that was entirely appropriate and professional, and that Eleanor suspected had taken him 3 drafts to write, because Thomas was not a man comfortable with the more emotional categories of human experience, which was one of the things that made him excellent at his work. She sent him a photo of the baby. He replied 4 hours later with a single line. "She has good timing." Eleanor wrote back, "She gets it from her grandmother." Thomas did not reply to that, which meant it had affected him, which Eleanor considered a complete victory. The reconciliation between Eleanor and Maggie, the real one, the deep and necessary one, happened across several weeks in the golden kitchen of the new house, over coffee in the morning light. Not in one conversation, but in many. Not performed, but worked through the way real things between real people are worked through when the love is genuine enough to survive honesty, and the honesty is genuine enough to be worth the discomfort of saying it fully. Eleanor said, one morning in March, when the light was particularly good and the baby was asleep in the carrier on her chest. I know you didn't mean to. I knew it immediately, but it still cost me something. Maggie said, I know. And I am going to spend a long time being sorry about that. Not performing sorry. Actually sorry. Eleanor said, I know the difference. Maggie said, I know you do. They sat with that. The baby slept. The morning light moved across the table, the way it moved every morning in that kitchen, gold and unhurried, as if it had nowhere more important to be. You're going to be a good mother, Maggie said. Eleanor looked down at her daughter's sleeping face, at the hands, at the particular curve of the fingers that were Virginia's, that were now also hers, that would someday belong to the small person currently sleeping against her chest with the profound confidence of someone who has found exactly where they belong. She said, I had a good teacher. The Geneva board meeting in April was held via video conference on a Tuesday morning. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table in the new house with her laptop open, and Virginia Margaret in a carrier on her chest, asleep as she had been reliably asleep during the previous 3 board meetings, which Eleanor had decided to take as evidence of good judgment on her daughter's part. Thomas Wren appeared on screen at the start of the call. He saw the baby immediately, the small sleeping face visible above the carrier, and stopped mid-sentence. For approximately 5 seconds, the most composed and professionally precise attorney, Eleanor, had worked with for 9 years, completely lost his composure. His face did something it very rarely did in professional settings, which was become entirely human. Then he cleared his throat. He said, She has good timing. Eleanor said, She gets it from her grandmother. The board laughed. Eleanor smiled. Virginia Margaret slept through the entire meeting without registering any concern about the quarterly projections being reviewed around her, which Virginia Cole would have found deeply funny, and which Eleanor found, privately, one of the more perfect moments of the year so far. The work continued. It had always continued. This was not a story about a woman who stopped working while her life fell apart. It was a story about a woman who kept working precisely because the work was one of the truest things about her. One of the things that had never been subject to anyone else's version of events. The Geneva portfolio grew. The domestic educational initiatives she had funded anonymously for 11 years began operating under her name publicly for the first time, which changed the conversation she was invited into and the invitations she extended. Patricia Norwood's foundation in Boston became a formal partner on 2 new projects. The work expanded in the way that work expands when the person doing it is finally operating in full daylight rather than in the careful shadow of someone else's comfort. Eleanor drove to the cemetery on a morning in late April when the Connecticut air had finally decided it was spring and was making good on that decision, warm and soft and carrying the particular smell of things coming back. She brought yellow tulips because Virginia had always said yellow was the color of things that were still growing. She placed them at the base of the headstone, clean and new, bearing Virginia Cole's full name and the years that contained her remarkable and sufficient life. She stood there for a while. The cemetery was quiet, mostly empty, the old trees around its edge just beginning to leaf. She said the things you say to the dead when you need them to know. Not out loud, not exactly, but in the particular internal way of a daughter standing at her mother's grave in the first real spring after her mother died. She said she was all right. She said it without decoration, without the performance of certainty she might have offered an audience. She said it simply, as a true thing. She was all right. She was building something, and it felt like the right kind of building. The kind that starts with a real foundation and goes up from there without needing to hide itself from anyone. She said she had kept the journal. She read it still. She said she had placed it on the windowsill in the study of the new house when she first moved in because she wanted it to be the first thing she settled in its right place. She said she had found a line last week she did not remember reading before in Virginia's handwriting from what looked like 1994. The woman who knows what she is worth does not need to argue the number. She simply lives it, and the number becomes obvious. She said, "I think I understand that now." She said goodbye and walked back to her car across the grass that was just turning green, the light low and gold around her, the whole cemetery quietly holding everything it was made to hold. She did not hurry. She had been in too much of a hurry for too long, carrying too much, too quietly in too small a space. She walked the way Virginia had always walked, deliberately, upright, like a woman who knows where she is going and does not need to rush the arriving, because the arriving is already certain. That evening, she made herself dinner at the kitchen table and set it properly. Cloth napkin, the good plates, a single white candle, in the holder she had bought at the farmer's market in March, because Virginia had believed that a woman should treat herself like company worth having, and Eleanor had believed this too for a long time and had simply, in the years of the marriage, gradually stopped practicing it. She ate slowly. She listened to music she liked. Virginia Margaret slept in the bassinet in the corner of the kitchen in the way of a person who has found their preferred location and sees no reason to complicate things. When she was done, Eleanor washed the dishes by hand, dried them, put them away. She stood in the clean kitchen in the quiet of her own house and felt what she had been working toward for longer than she could precisely name. She felt like herself, fully and without remainder like herself. The way you feel when something that has always been true about you has finally been allowed to take up its proper space in the world without apology or negotiation or the constant small compressions that accumulate over years into a shape that is not quite yours. She went to the study. She picked up Virginia's journal from the windowsill where it lived, felt its familiar worn weight, the softness of the cover from 30 years of being handled by careful hands. She did not open it. She held it for a moment. Then she set it back in the patch of evening light that reached the windowsill at this hour. She looked at it for a moment, at its worn edges, its soft cover, all those years of a woman's careful thinking pressed between its pages. Then she walked away. Toward the sound of her daughter, beginning to wake in the kitchen, making the small experimental sounds of a person discovering that the world is large and interesting and worth investigating. She walked toward it without looking back. Some people spend their whole lives trying to dismantle a woman who is never actually breakable. They mistook her silence for emptiness. They mistook her patience for permission. They mistook her stillness for having nothing left. They were wrong about all of it. Eleanor Hartwell had $40.2 billion, a daughter with her mother's hands, a best friend who showed up every Saturday without being asked and named succulents after the doorman, a doorman who kept ginger ale at the front desk and asked no unnecessary questions, and an attorney who had been ready for 6 months before anyone thought to look. She did not need a single person in that ballroom to call it winning. She already knew what it was. She had always known. She had simply been waiting for the moment when the truth finished being patient and became visible to everyone else. If this story found you today, if something in it landed somewhere real, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are building something right now, in the quiet, without applause, without anyone watching, without anyone who even knows to look, keep going. The receipts are adding up. And one day the room will go still, and the number will appear on the screen, and you will already know You always knew. The content you just heard, and the full story that follows, was researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team to bring you not just entertainment, but meaning. Every detail was chosen with intention. Every lesson was earned. We hope it stays with you long after the story ends.